Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. What if you could get groceries delivered in as fast as an hour without leaving the comfort of your home? If you're like me, going to the grocery store is the last thing you want to do after a long day. Instacart makes it easy to take care of the grocery shopping, and they now offer contactless delivery to have your items delivered safely to your front door. Use the app or visit instacart.com to shop from all your favorite retailers, including local stores. In just a few taps, you can get everything you need to make a scrumptious breakfast, a late night snack, and everything in between. Follow the link in the show notes to let Instacart know we sent you and to support the show and get free delivery on your first order over $35. Hello and welcome to another episode of Creative Piecemeal Podcast. Today we are talking with Jennifer Higdon. Jennifer Higdon is a Pulitzer Prize and 3-time Grammy winner, is one of the most performed living American composers working today. She's the recent recipient of Northwestern University's Nemmers Prize and the UT Austin E.M. King Award. Previous awards include the Guggenheim, Koussevitzky, and Pew Fellowships, as well as 2 awards from the American Academy of Arts and Lectures. Commissions have come from a wide range of performers, from the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Chicago Symphony to the President's own Marine Band, from the Tokyo String Quartet to Eighth Blackbird, as well as individual artists such as singer Thomas Hampson, violinist Hilary Hahn, and pianist Yuja Wang. Her first opera on Charles Frazier's book, Cold Mountain, was commissioned by Santa Fe Opera, Opera Philadelphia, NC Opera, and Minnesota Opera, selling out all of its runs and winning the International Opera Award. She makes her living from commissions, and her works are recorded on over 70 CDs. The recording of her Percussion Concerto with Colin Currie and the London Philharmonic was recently inducted into the Library of Congress National Recording Registry. Jennifer Higdon holds the Rock Chair in Composition at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Tammy. Good to be here.
It is an honor to have you here. As a person who's a musician, I actually started my journey in school wanting to be a composition major, and it's so hard. It's so hard. Over the years, I majored in other music things, but I commend you for doing something that is so creative.
Thank you. So do you still compose?
I do a little bit for my work. As a music therapist, I sometimes compose songs specifically for the people I work with, but it's definitely not quite the same realm.
Yeah, I often think composers are just combining notes, and we've got people writing music, pop songs, video music, movie music. I think there's so many different ways to be writing music that, to me, they all share so many similarities that I don't really differentiate that much between them.
Very true. They may have similarities. The end goals have completely different outcomes, but they definitely share similarities in terms of the musical aspects and maybe even sometimes the inspirations and motivations behind them.
Right. That makes sense.
So you started as a self-taught musician before completing formal training at some of the most prestigious music schools and going on to earn your doctorate. Who or what inspired you to become a musician at the beginning?
It's a really good question. I always knew when I was growing up that I was going to be some sort of an artist because my dad was a commercial artist, but he was in visual arts. And I think just being in a household with an artist was enough to make me want to be creative as an adult. I stumbled upon the music. I'd always been kind of attracted to music, but I didn't play an instrument. I didn't take lessons at a young age. And then one day I found a flute in the attic that my mom had gotten at a pawn shop. And so there was a level 1 beginning band method book there, and I picked that up and I taught myself to play and then worked my way through the other books, which when I think back on it probably really wasn't that advanced, but it enabled me to play flute in the high school marching band. And that's kind of the thing that got me hooked. Something about the camaraderie with other people playing music, and then maybe the sound world that I heard. I was always aware of sound growing up and very conscious of how different kinds of music made me feel. But it wasn't really till I was in high school when I decided, you know what, maybe I'd like to make a living in music. So it's considered a fairly late start, but I seem to have managed okay.
Yes, it is so impressive considering, you always read about musicians starting at 4 and 5, and to read that you started later and still were able to pursue that and become so successful is so inspiring, especially to any late bloomers out there.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, Tammy, I didn't exhibit like extraordinary talent or anything when I was in my early days. Actually, in my early days would have been my college days. But you're right, it's a really late start, and it really came down to just loving music and sticking with it. When some of my classmates would drop out for various reasons, and there are all kinds of reasons. So it was a matter of just continuing with it and continue to explore and always be open to learning. That's the thing that kind of helped me, I think, along on my journey.
And I think that's a great testament to any pursuit that someone wants to do or any dream, like it doesn't necessarily matter when you start, it just matters that you start and that you keep going.
Right, exactly.
Again, you went on to do composition. Were you inspired by any composers growing up, or do you have any favorite composers nowadays?
Oh boy, I guess yes to all of those questions. It's hard to pick favorite composers. I think it's funny, I didn't grow up on classical music. So for me, my favorite composers were like the Beatles, so Lennon and McCartney, because that's kind of what I grew up hearing when I was younger. And, to be quite honest, to this day, they're probably my favorite composers. I got to hand it to the Beatles for their ingenuity and creativity, but also their melodic writing. Now I'm always checking out what my colleagues are doing. I'm always listening to what they've written most recently, what has been released on recordings. I'm a big fan of Stravinsky. Of course, I don't really know any composers who aren't. I love Copland, Debussy, and Ravel. I do remember when I was younger, growing up, my mom had some sort of album that had a bunch of Debussy pieces in an electronic form. They were actually piano preludes, but that made quite the impression on me. But I feel like I've absorbed music from everywhere. I like all kinds of music. I don't feel like I have things divided up in my head. So, and I'm always trying to check out what people are doing now. What's the latest thing that's been done? And not only in classical, but also in rock and country and bluegrass. And I just find music fascinating.
I completely agree. And of course, as musicians, we go to school, we train, and we're exposed to lots of different types of music. And, everything from minimalist music to rock music to jazz. Is there one specific type of music that you say, or even an artist or a band that really influences your own work?
Oh, I don't know that there's anyone in particular. I mean, it's funny because I am a composer that writes on commission. Usually I get inspired by the people I'm working with, the people I'm writing for. To me, that's actually more the influence. But I think I'm also, at all times, I'm constantly listening, whether I'm watching like a series like Bridgerton or something, which has kind of amazing music. My ears and my brain are constantly analyzing what they're hearing. And I don't know that there's a single source. I try to absorb from a lot of different places. And I'm pretty sure as a result, I'm influenced by a lot of different angles, composers, and even types of music. I think it's probably just a giant mosh pit in my brain, really, to kind of put it all in there, and then it kind of comes out when I'm writing pieces. I mean, I just finished a mandolin concerto, and so I've been listening to a lot of mandolin music, and that's music I didn't really know before I started the concerto. But I can't say that I haven't been like tremendously influenced by that, because I've listened to so much of it. I'm like, wow, this is a great instrument. So the influences come from everywhere.
And that's fantastic too, because it means there's more tools in your toolbox, so to speak.
Right, right. That's actually the phrase I often use with students. We're going to build up their toolbox to figure out how to problem solve a situation in music. Toolboxes are good.
Would you like to talk a little bit about any of your current projects? I noticed that you've got some commissions down in the Houston area coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had quite a bit of connection with Houston this year. I just had a string quartet premiered by the Apollo Chamber Players that they commissioned. It's music taken from my opera Cold Mountain and made into a string quartet. And we just had the premiere for that. It was a virtual premiere, which was its own challenge, but it was so much fun to hear them. And I'm so looking forward to finally meeting them later in 2021 when we record the work. I also, during this pandemic, I finished a double percussion concerto for the Houston Symphony. That was originally supposed to be performed in, I believe it was April, and now they're getting ready to reschedule. It takes a large orchestra, so a bigger group of musicians than you might want together on a stage right now. And I've just finished a mandolin concerto, and I've done 4 chamber works, believe it or not, since I came in on March 8th. So it's 2 concerti and 4 chamber works, and I'm about to start a solo violin piece, and after that is saxophone and piano, and after that's a flute concerto. So a lot of cool projects, a lot of repertoire to explore, but it keeps it interesting for me because it's constantly varying.
That sounds wonderful. And it sounds like you've definitely been keeping busy during this really challenging time in history.
Yeah, this has not been so easy, I think, for anyone at all. I'm very fortunate in that I make my living from writing music from commissions, which means that basically I'm in anyway writing music, even when things are fine. What happens is basically I'm out on the road a little too much during the year when things are at a normal pace, sometimes doing orchestra residencies, sometimes doing university residencies. If we're doing recordings, I'll travel to that. If it's a world premiere, I'll travel. So I spend some time on the road, but the rest of the time I'm in my studio writing. So when this started, I realized right off the bat as it was approaching, because I was watching it in other countries, that basically I was going to be able to just stay in and write, that was the thing. And I also realized that this was going to be really stressful, and the thing that would help me the most would be to have some sort of routine that was familiar to me. So I thought, all right, this is going to be some substantial time to compose. I can really sit and think about the art. I don't have to run off to some sort of meeting or something. I've been home just writing lots of music. And in the beginning, it was kind of tough. I have to admit, my ability to focus and concentrate was compromised, like I think everyone was, wondering what was going to happen. So my fight or flight brain had kicked in. And in the first, I think, month or so, maybe even 6 weeks, it was hard for me to work more than an hour a day on composing. I'd feel very exhausted. But I knew if I kept up with it, that it's just like training for athletics. If you keep up and keep adding time, you start to build the endurance. And after about 3 months, I was back to the point where I could write 4 to 6 hours a day, which is what I've been doing, which is probably why I've got quite a bit of music that's been written.
I've talked to a lot of artists, and they all say, the pandemic has definitely changed their creative process a little bit. Would you say that your process, as this has gone on, has evolved to become something better, or is it pretty much the same as what you've been doing before?
It's actually, for me, pretty much the same as I was doing. Because I do this as a full-time thing, it means that my entire work setup and my brain is geared in that direction. My teaching that I do every year at Curtis is really minimal. It's 2 hours a week. So it's not like I have to kind of adjust to thinking around my regular day job. My day job is composing. The one thing I have noticed that has changed is I'm tending to go for more contemplative music. The music that's coming out is more contemplative. It's also a lot more melodic. Not that my other music wasn't melodic, but when I was writing this double percussion concerto, it's interesting. I was at the very beginning of it when I went into quarantine. And with percussion, if you're writing for them, you have the option of using a lot of drums, cymbals, lots of different sounds that don't have pitch. You can kind of mix it up and do pitch to non-pitch, but I think because of the pandemic, I actually ended up writing a very melodic double percussion concerto, a lot of melody, and I only chose instruments for the soloist that can play melodically, and that's a little unusual. But I have found that maybe because I'm sitting and thinking more or something, or maybe because the world is quieter right now. In Philadelphia, it's still very, very quiet. People aren't out and about that much. I tend to be hearing the music a little more clearly. That sounds strange, but it's almost like there's a radio playing in my head. And even though I don't hear things in their completion, I've noticed that everything is a lot more melodic. And some of it's a lot more slow. So it's I can feel that it's different. I'm not always able to articulate what's happening, but it was really noticeable with the double percussion concerto for Houston Symphony. That was the thing I realized, that when I'm making choices where I could go with drums or I can go with a marimba, and every time it was the marimba or it was the vibraphone, so more melodic material.
I look forward to hearing those in the future, especially being a Houston resident myself.
You guys have a lot of good stuff going on down there. Can I just say that? It's real. There's a lot of great music making in Houston. It's impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, it's there really is a lot going on in this city, and it's just amazing what you can find in every little corner. I'm personally a big fan of Mercury Chamber Orchestra because they play with alternate historic tuning and things of that nature. I really gravitate toward the Baroque music.
That's great. That's really, I mean, I think it's always good for a community to have active music in it. Active music making. There are whole cultures where everybody makes music, and there tends to be a lot more harmony in those cultures, which is kind of a cool thing.
Yes, definitely. So one thing I've been curious to ask, if you had to compose music to encapsulate your life, what genre would it be?
I have no idea. Well, I think probably to encapsulate my life would probably be an orchestra, because you have a wide range of color and different levels of power. I always think of the orchestra as like the biggest box of crayons you could find. It's interesting because I find that I don't really examine my life that much. I'm too busy living it, I think. There's probably people on the outside who have opinions on that. I'm literally so focused on the music I'm writing, that's all I'm thinking about. I never sit back and say, oh, this is my life and this is what's happened. And I tend to analyze it. I figure if it has any kind of meaning for anyone, and if they're a musicologist, they will look at the music, that probably will tell them everything they need to know. But I have to confess, I'm so obsessed with the notes on the page and how those communicate to the audience that I never think about this kind of stuff.
That's certainly not a bad thing. It definitely shows that you're passionate and you love what you do.
Right. I hope so. I hope that's what it means.
So you've done a lot of things in the last year, and you said you haven't really been too challenged with life changing, but is there anything that you do feel is a challenge coming into this new year, and given your role as a composer, and how would you meet those challenges?
Yeah, the biggest challenge for me actually is trying to deal with I think I've had 7 world premieres delayed, and the logistics of that is really intense. In a normal year when we're not in a pandemic, it's hard getting through my year as it is, because I have enough premieres in a year that sometimes the traveling, like I can be dashing from one place to the next. Right before I came in on March 8th for the pandemic, I had spent 2 weeks down at Artist Colony in Florida, ACA, and I was teaching a bunch of students, and I had to do a quick dash to Nashville to record with the Nashville Symphony. And it's kind of like my life, where sometimes I'm home writing for weeks at a time, and then suddenly I'm on the road and I'm running between things. Knowing that a lot has to be rescheduled is going to be seriously challenging. I had an opera that was supposed to premiere this past September, and operas are huge to put up. They take up several months. You can't do anything else when they're happening. They require so much attention and energy. And so that had gotten recently rescheduled to this coming September, but the opera company just informed me a couple days ago that they're going to have to move it off to 2024. So for me, it's trying to figure out how to make sure there's not overlap in these premieres so that I have to skip one of the premieres. That seems disrespectful to the commissioners. So I worry about the scheduling a little bit. I'm trying to figure out how am I going to manage this. And I mean, it's a good problem to have in reality, because it means that I've got things lined up on my schedule that are commissions. And it's kind of the way I've been able to make a living throughout this pandemic. I guess I've been working because these are projects that were scheduled to go up in the next year or so. But everything is kind of getting shifted around. And my biggest concern right now, to be honest, is just the music industry in general. I worry about all the performers, the orchestras, the choirs, the opera companies. I mean, this is a really tough thing, and it's unprecedented. We can't look to another time period that has a similar sort of set of circumstances. So trying to figure out how we're going to manage this is a little worrisome. And, if I think about it too much, I get kind of wigged out. So I try to put my attention back down on the thing I can control, which is putting notes on a page.
Right. I was just going to say that, we as creative artists can only do so much, and we got to go with the flow.
Right. That's it exactly.
We're going to switch gears here for a moment. When you won your Pulitzer, obviously a very esteemed honor, what was that like when you found out the big news?
Well, it was really overwhelming. I think for the whole first year after it happened, it was very, very overwhelming. I remember calling. You find out usually in the afternoon, believe it or not. And the day they announce it, at 3:00, they announce it. And they announce it to the press. They don't notify you in advance that you won. So basically what happens is your phone explodes with people calling, different news outlets wanting some sort of comment to get your feelings about it. And there's so much adrenaline from that I remember thinking, God, I hope I don't say something completely idiotic, but I think I must have been like 24 interviews. I had a concert that night. I found out at 3:00 and my students had a concert at 8. I did about 24 interviews and grabbed some food in between those two events, find the actual phone call and running to the concert. But I remember calling my parents to tell them, and this is the first time in my life I ever said to them, you need to sit down. I remember my dad was like, what? I need to sit down? I said, Dad, you need to sit down. And when I told him, I don't think he could believe it, but I can't blame him. I couldn't believe it either. So people were excited. It was very sweet to see how people were moved. And I have to admit, for me, it was completely overwhelming. But now that I've spoken with other Pulitzer winners, apparently it's like this for everyone. It takes years to adjust to the idea that you've won one of these things. I'm still caught off guard when someone says, oh, there's a Pulitzer winner in the audience here. I literally look around still not realizing they're actually talking about me. So it can be intimidating. I have to admit that it's the kind of thing that it's so big, because I must have done interviews after the day it was announced. It must have been 6, 7, 8 weeks. I was still doing interviews. Everything you're working on has to come to a complete stop. But what was interesting for me, because I handle the publishing, have a really busy publishing company, suddenly we were getting an unbelievable number of orders. I can remember one day we got an order for 100 scores that came in. So one of the things that happened was I had to kick in. Normally I'm not doing the printing and binding, but I started handling that and walking the boxes to FedEx. So I think there are a bunch of people in my neighborhood who think I'm a delivery person, actually. So it's overwhelming, though, Tammy. The thing is not to let it interfere with your composing. And that, again, it was the same thing. I realized after a couple of days of pure adrenaline in my system that if I just sat down and wrote music, that's something I'm familiar with. Getting right back into a routine made it a little easier to cope. And it probably took me about a month, 6 weeks before I slept again, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I was wondering that, the Pulitzer and the 3 Grammys are well-deserved, well-earned by you. I love your work and creativity. and I was just curious, how do you move forward after winning something so big? And I guess being true to yourself is really what it's about, just accepting those awards and then just keep doing what you're doing, because it's obviously working.
It is, yeah. And, I have to admit, when the Grammy, it's kind of, a lot of people don't know, so when the Grammy showed up, I won the Grammy in 2010. The first Grammy was in the end of January in 2010. And the Pulitzer was just a couple of months later. And most people don't know this, but the Grammys, when you win one, they get sent out to you months after the ceremony. And so the day the Pulitzer happened, I got a notice from FedEx that I had a package being held down at the airport in Philadelphia. And I realized, I said, oh my gosh, this must be the Grammy. And then I won the Pulitzer that afternoon. So the next morning, I remember I had an unbelievable headache. It was all the adrenaline in my body. I went to the local drugstore to just get some aspirin. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, because I needed to drive down to the airport and pick up this package. And I thought, God, how lucky am I? I heard the pharmacist. I was friends with my pharmacist, and I heard him asking a person at the counter what their address was. And the person at the counter said, I don't have an address. I'm out on the street. And at that moment, I had such a beautiful moment of clarity, because I realized how fortunate I was to be able to do something that I love and be paid for it. That the Pulitzer and the Grammys, they're nice, but they're not why we do it. And it's kind of incredible honor, really, because so many of your colleagues are involved in these sorts of things in the voting process, that it's an honor basically from your colleagues, but it's also not the focus. And it's actually the art that is the focus. And that's the thing you have to remember. It's a really hard lesson to learn, and it often trips up people after these things. Just because I've won those things doesn't mean the next piece is going to be great. And I'm aware of that I have a responsibility to my commissioners to step up, make sure I'm doing the best I can. These awards are fantastic. They're great recognition, but they don't mean I'm a good person, and they don't mean that I write great music. So I take it literally one day at a time and focus on the art and just try to make sure I'm doing the best thing that I can in my work.
And that's a fantastic outlook to have, because in the creative field, everything seems to be a roller coaster sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is. And it still is for me as well. I mean, we're all on that kind of roller coaster experience. This is the thing. A lot of people say to me, oh, your life must be great. You sit at home and you write music, and, what more can you ask for? And I agree, it is absolutely fantastic. But there are the downs. There are things that go wrong. There are pieces that don't come out well, and you think, all right, I got to fix this. But we all have to deal with those things. And the most important thing is how you deal with them. This is the difference. You run across barriers in life, and you just have to find a way around the barrier or over the barrier, or maybe you need to invent a new way to make a tunnel. Every single person on this planet has to go through that. So I'm just like everyone else. I actually don't have the answers, although sometimes when people look at my resume, they're like, oh, you must have the answers. I'm like, well, no, not really. But you know what? We'll be creative. We'll work together and see if we can figure something out. So it's an attitude thing, I guess.
Very true. Very true. That having a positive outlook on life, I feel gets people through so many barriers and helps push them to be successful and happy.
I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true.
Along those lines, what would you tell a young budding composer who wants to do this for a career track? Do you have any specific advice for that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think you have to try to write as much music as you can, and then try to get it played by musicians where you can have a conversation. If you can figure out if what you're putting on the page works, that's a good idea. It's the best way to learn, really, is to write and hear what's being done. I often tell composers too to don't feel like they have to write a huge symphony. You don't have to write a huge symphony. It's impossible to get a huge symphony even programmed. Write chamber music. Write for your friends. Write for a small group. Don't write 30-minute works. Try writing a 4-minute work or a 6-minute work. You learn a lot more actually in that process of trying to be very succinct with your ideas. And I often tell composers, listen to as much music as you can, and if you can possibly do it, hold a score in your hand, because the fact is you can look at that score and you can learn a lot by looking at how other composers move the notes around on the page. What decisions did they make? What instruments are they using? What do instruments sound like in different ranges? So it's a constant learning experience, to be quite honest, Tammy. And I'm constantly studying things. I'm a former flute player. I haven't played in a long time, and I have a flute concerto coming up on my schedule, and I'm going to have to sit down and look at the repertoire. I'm not going to assume that I know it because I played the instrument. So it's kind of a persistence and thinking one step at a time and trying to figure out how to move the ball forward. But practice, it does really help. It doesn't make you perfect, but it does get you closer towards it.
And that's all fantastic advice. I know when I was composing a lot when I was in high school and even into college, I did exactly that. I tried to write small things for friends. Granted, I didn't go on to become a composer, but it's definitely something that fulfilled a creative outlet that I needed at the time.
It does. It is interesting. Creating something from nothing is kind of an amazing experience, because even now I look at my pieces, I look at the violin concerto that won the Pulitzer, and I'm like, where did this come from? I actually, it takes me, I can write 4 to 6 hours in a day, and I may only get 10 to 15 seconds of music written. So that's it. That means you're really kind of having to work at it every day to kind of move a bigger piece forward. But because of that, you're examining small little areas of real estate and trying to figure out, how do I make this work well? And in that process, you end up accumulating a lot of notes, a lot of measures, and before you know it, a couple of months have gone by and you've got a 30-minute violin concerto. But I step back and I look at it, and when I hear that piece played, I'm like, where did that come from? So there's a part of the subconscious that's actually it's so necessary in the process, and it's important, but you kind of have to respect it because it is subconscious, and you can't really control a lot of it. I think this is some of the connections to inspiration that come at you. I think that's where it comes from.
One of your most performed pieces is Blue Cathedral. Do you have a favorite memory or story about your time working on that piece?
Blue Cathedral is probably my most personal piece because I wrote it after losing a brother to cancer. I think it was hard to write, and I really had a lot of doubts. It was painful because I was wrestling when I was writing. I was wrestling whether life was going to be about living or if it was going to be about dying. I was still like really heavily into a space of grief and trying to figure out how to move forward and what would that look like. And so in a certain way, Blue Cathedral was very cathartic for me. It helped me grieve. And the last part of the piece I can remember as I was writing it, that I cried a lot. It's amazing trying to write through tears. But I think one of the things about that particular piece that it really moves me is how it affects other people. Sometimes I have people come up to me and they can't speak. They have tears in their eyes, and they take my hands, and they just, you can tell by looking in their eyes that the piece has really touched them. And to me, that's just like the ultimate compliment. It's not the kind of thing we expect with a contemporary work, but the fact of the matter is contemporary works can do that. They can absolutely touch you on a very deep level. And Blue Cathedral's had a kind of an amazing level of success. That piece has been done by 700 orchestras, and it continues to get programmed around the world. I mean, everywhere. And I get letters from people, and I get emails from people who have heard it. And I'm at the point where I'm actually meeting musicians who played it when they were in some sort of high school honor group, and now they're playing professionally in an orchestra. And they sometimes say their first experience with new music was Blue Cathedral. And you can tell that it means something to them. So that communication, it's absolutely everything. And it thrills me to no end that that particular piece really affects people.
I definitely feel that at least from what I hear when I listen to it, it feels like your heart is just put on the line, and it transcends the notes, and people can hear through the composition your journey.
Yeah. And you know what? I have to admit, I've now talked to enough people, I realize it's not only my journey, it's everyone's journey. That's the reality of that piece. There's something about the journey that is just so expressive. And it's not that I know how the heck I did it. I don't know. I mean, music, there's an element there we can't account for that is magic. And somehow the magic is in that piece. And I'm touched, because it meant a lot to me, but that didn't necessarily mean it was going to translate for others. But I'm just kind of amazed at the reaction. I know the Houston Symphony's done the work before. It's been done actually with quite a few different ensembles around there. I remember I was down with the Houston Symphony, was doing a performance of my Concerto for Orchestra, and there was one of the local high schools was also doing Blue Cathedral at that same time. So it's kind of an incredible experience to be a part of that piece. It almost feels like that piece belongs to the world now, belongs to everyone.
It really is a fantastic piece. I never played it in high school myself, but I've heard it.
Well, thank you.
We're going to switch gears a little bit. Back to advice for young composers. What do you think is the most common myth about being a composer, a professional composer?
It's interesting. I think, first of all, there are two bits. For people who are outside of music, usually there are composers. People find it mysterious that there are composers. It sounds strange, but they're like, I thought Mozart was like the last one, or Beethoven. And I'm like, oh, there's composers everywhere. Everyone writes music for all kinds of different things. You're just not used to basically hearing it or thinking about the fact that a composer wrote the music. In the music world, I think the most common concept amongst performers is that the contemporary music may be scary. That seems like that's the thing that I encounter the most. Although I have to admit, even that is decreasing, that contemporary music has taken on a language and a form that seems to be communicating better with audiences and with the performers themselves. The biggest mistake that's made by young composers in their concept of the whole experience of being a composer is people feel like it's going to be a job full of work, but basically not a completely heavy duty work, and that it's an easy life. And the fact is, it's not really an easy life. You really have to have a lot of direction, self-motivation. You have to be willing to get a lot of work done. And what sometimes happens is people who want to be in music but don't know if they can actually make a living playing an instrument will sometimes turn towards composition. And they think, well, I can manage this I can do. But the fact is, it's hard enough, and it's hard enough to make a living doing it, that the majority of the people who actually train in composition don't end up doing that once they leave college. So the misconception kind of runs in different directions depending on who you're talking about. But I think it's mysterious. People think we all are like Amadeus, the movie, with Mozart sitting there with a quill and ink, just writing out the notes. And there's a lot more intensive labor that goes into it. It's a little more complex. Actually, it's a lot more complex than that imagery.
Very true. Is there anything that you wish you had known when you first started?
No, I think actually the fact that I had no idea how big this mountain was to climb was a good thing. The fact that I didn't know anything, it meant that at no point in time that I stop and say, oh, can I do this? And the fact that I grew up in a household with an artist who worked self-employed in the house helped me in a certain way to, I guess, move forward thinking, oh yeah, I can figure out a way to do this. However it needs to happen, I can figure out a way to make it happen. So that's a lot of people run up against issues with their parents not being okay with them being in the arts. But because I grew up in a household with an artist, my dad said, you can make any kind of art you want, but you got to just figure out how to pay the bills. But if you work hard enough, you can figure out a way to do it. So I think it's good I didn't know more than I do, because now I look back and I'm like, how the heck did I even pull that off? I think I would have been very skeptical if I knew then what I know now. I might have hesitated. I wonder. So it's probably better I didn't know anything.
Probably best for everybody to not know where they're going to end up.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of that way, I think, for a lot of things. People just don't realize. But, if you're taking a really big hike that has a lot of miles, because I used to do a lot of hiking, it's better not to think about the 26 miles to get across the Grand Canyon. It's better to take it one step at a time. That actually makes it possible to make that journey and not be intimidated by the fact that it's an overwhelming journey if you really look at the totality of it. But it's so worth it. I mean, really, to go through the experience, that taking it one step at a time does really work better.
And all for the sake of art. Like you said, it's not very common for people to be able to do something that they love and do something that they've majored in even for a living and be successful. So
yeah, that's true. And it's funny, a lot of college students, I think, don't always realize that. And there's no reason why they would, but people major in all kinds of things in college and then they end up doing something completely different. But the fact that they've gone to college kind of teaches you, first of all, is that there are ways to solve problems. It kind of widens your world enough to look around and say, oh, maybe I thought I wanted to do A, but maybe I want to do B. And I don't know, a lot of times that doesn't happen if you don't have the chance to kind of try different things and be around other people trying other things. So there's definitely an advantage there. But the truth is, most people, they major in something, they don't always go into that. I think the majority of the time, surveys that alumni associations have shown that oftentimes people do something completely different than whatever their major was.
I remember reading an article that there were Juilliard graduates, these top performers who were working in an office building.
Yeah, I remember that article. It came out in the New York Times. They followed up on a class 10 years after they graduated. The majority of the people weren't actually even doing music at that point. It was that was a shocking article. That was a moment when we all said, what? It was kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think that may have been the turning point when a lot of schools said, okay, we need to teach music business and we need to teach how to market yourself.
It was. Yeah, that's actually exactly what happened. I remember that was the conversation that happened at Curtis. I remember standing in the faculty lounge literally a day or two after that article came out and them saying, maybe we need to think about this. And sure enough, they did exactly that. They started creating classes for entrepreneurship and also classes just dealing with basic finances as an artist, grant writing, and putting together resumes, headshots, and all kinds of things like that. So you're right. It was incredible. One article like that could trigger so much discussion and also just change in the industry.
For the better, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. I think so too.
So before we let you go, I love to ask this question. It's one of my favorites. But if you could have dinner with any creative person or a few people, dead or alive, who would it be?
I think, oh God, it's a really good question. I think I'd love to have a meal with Leonardo da Vinci and Beethoven. Maybe these two might be really interesting conversations to sit down and really discuss creativity, pushing the envelope and charging forward in places where people have not gone before. So I think I might add Stravinsky to that group. I don't know, but there's something about Beethoven that we still find kind of magical, and it would be interesting to talk to him about his thinking Although I guess you can kind of do that when you're looking at his works. But, sometimes having the conversation with a composer is something. But and then I look at all the things Leonardo da Vinci did. It just blows my mind. The artwork, but also just the design and the things he studied. And I've taken drawing classes, so I'm very aware of the amount of work that he did with anatomy and drawing objects and inventing to know how much it has affected the visual art world. So I think either Beethoven or Leonardo, or I'll take both of them if I can. That would be pretty amazing.
That does sound fantastic. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can our listeners connect with you via social media?
I was thinking about this because I'm not on social media as much as a lot of my colleagues, and it has more to do with the fact that I haven't had time really. But I have a professional page on Facebook, and I post all kinds of things on there, and people write me on there, just Jennifer Higdon. You can find it, the page. If people send me messages, I get the messages, and that's probably the extent of it in reality. I mean, I get emails from people, but I think I have an Instagram account, but I'm not really sure, which means it's probably inactive. So.
And of course, listeners, you can find more information about Jennifer Higdon at her website, www.jenniferhigdon.com.
And feel free to come up and say hi. We resume concerts. They will happen. It's coming. But feel free to drop by and say hi. If I'm in the audience or something, I love meeting folks. So I'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Definitely a dream come true to have you as a guest.
Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate it very much.
If you enjoy my podcast, Creative Piecemeal, then check out Musician's Dish. Freelance musicians Robin Anderson and Audra Sergel are longtime pals, work wives, music teachers, recording artists, church musicians, directors, advocates, and now podcasters. Their bi-monthly conversations casually examine the ins and outs of being modern music entrepreneurs with multiple earning streams. Sometimes these conversations devolve into the gutter. Other times, they're truly uplifting. Every episode is a dish. Listen in for epic gig stories, ways they did and didn't survive 2020, not a great year for musicians or most people as it turns out, how they handle performance anxiety and maneuver the healthcare system, how they get paid, and the worst jobs they've taken for $100 or less, including some adjunct work. Every episode of Musician's Dish is a deep dive for your ear holes, curse words guaranteed. New episodes every other Monday. Listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor FM, or wherever you like to tune in. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.